All right, we're back out of here. Chapter 8 through 14. We find ourselves in chapter 8. And here, on page 59 in my text, Huck escapes from his father's cabin, finds his way down the Mississippi River, and by chance bumps into his old friend Jim. And the conversation is an important one in the text here. It goes like this. Then I told him the whole thing, and he said it was smart. He said Tom Sawyer couldn't get up no better plan than what I had. Interesting how that's a compliment, right? Again, with our realism versus romanticism tension, Tom Sawyer is the one with all the romantic, extravagant plans and preparations, and he's the one who's able to think imaginatively. Ironically, Tom Sawyer is the one who is far more bound by the written word. It's Huck Finn, who again, ironically, is the one who's the real free thinker, although he is condemned for it by just about everyone. Here's another test for old Huck. Then I says, how come you come to be here, Jim? And how'd you get here? He looked pretty uneasy and didn't say nothing for a minute. Then he says, maybe I better not tell. Why, Jim? Well, dey's reasons. But you wouldn't tell on me if I was to tell you, would you, Huck? Notice that. If you look at that text there, you'll see, again, this idea of the dialectical writing, right? If I was to tell you, would you, Huck? Again, this idea of mimicking a dialect. Blame me if I would, Jim. Well, I believe you, Huck. I run off. Jim! But man, you said you wouldn't tell. You know you said you wouldn't tell, Huck. Well, I did. I said I wouldn't, and I'll stick to it. Honest Injun, I will. People would call me a low-down abolitionist and despise me for keeping mum. But that don't make no difference. I ain't a-going to tell. And I ain't a-going back there anyways, so now, let's know all about it. Obviously, we have some irony here. It's funny, you know, it's almost irony from a historical standpoint, right? In the South, at this time, an abolitionist would be called a low-down abolitionist, right? Because an abolitionist is one who is freeing slaves. The Southern view of this character, the abolitionist, is one who is helping set free the rightful property of a man or woman. Taking their slave. They bought that slave. That's their slave. What's this abolitionist doing taking our slave? Taking our own personal property. Almost as if someone was stealing someone's cattle. Why would I think that person's heroic? He just stole someone's cattle or their horse or whatever. So the irony is, obviously we look at that and we say, a low-down abolitionist. I think of abolitionists as great heroes, to be honest with you. I see those who fought for the eradication of slavery, the end of the slave trade, as great heroes. So here we have this cultural irony, right? And even a historical sense of irony from an historical perspective. Depending on where you are in history, depending on where you are geographically, you'll see that you'll see that in a different way. A low-down abolitionist or a heroic abolitionist. But here we see, again, as a local color writer, we've talked about that as a genre or a subgenre, a local color writer, Mark Twain is picking up on the feelings of people in the South toward the abolitionist. All right, so local color, Huck and society. We do have another tension here, man versus society, that's introduced here as well. He says, people will call me a low-down abolitionist and despise me for it, but the heck with it, that's fine. I'm not going to tell. I'm going to keep mum, as he says. In some ways, by this reaction, Huck shows, or Mark Twain reveals Huck as a young man who is ahead of society, who is a step ahead, who lives outside the mainstream, who lacks certain prejudices, or who is shedding prejudices. Let's jump ahead. Page 81. This is chapter 11. Page 81 says, the woman. kept looking at me pretty curious and says I didn't feel a bit comfortable. Pretty soon she says, "What did you say your name was, honey?" This is where Huck and Jim are going down the river, and they steal into these towns to pick up news, to pick up food and so forth, things they need, but they have to hide out. And Jim, or Huck, feels like it would be better for him to hide out and disguise himself as a girl, just in case some people are looking for him. "What'd you say your name was there, honey?" Mary Williams." Somehow it didn't seem to me that I said it was Mary before, so I didn't look up. It seemed to me I said it was Sarah, so I felt sort of cornered, and was afeared maybe I was looking it too. I wished the woman would say something more. The longer she sat still, the uneasier I was. But now she says, "Honey, I thought you said it was Sarah when you come first in." "Oh, yes'm, I did. Sarah Mary Williams. Sarah's my first name. Some calls me Sarah, some calls me Mary." In some ways, Huck has been considered a Byronic hero, or an anti-hero. University of Michigan article writes this, or includes this in a piece published by the University of Michigan. A Byronic hero is considered a rebel. A Byronic hero does not possess heroic virtue in the usual sense. Instead, he has many dark qualities. With regard to his intellectual capacity, self-respect, and hypersensitivity, the Byronic hero is larger than life. And, quote, "with the loss of his titanic passions, his pride, and his certainty of self-identity, he loses also his status as a traditional hero. He is usually isolated from society as a wanderer or is in exile of some kind. It does not matter whether this social separation is imposed upon him by some external force or is self-imposed." Lord Byron, wrote a text called Childe Harold, and his character Manfred is a character who wandered desolate mountaintops, was physically isolated from society, whereas Childe Harold chose to exile himself and wander throughout Europe. Although Harold remained physically present in society and among people, he was not by any means social. Often the Byronic hero is moody by nature or passionate about a particular issue. He also has emotional and intellectual capacities which are superior to the average man. These heightened abilities force the Byronic hero to be arrogant, confident, abnormally sensitive, and extremely conscious of himself. Sometimes this is to the point of nihilism, resulting in his rebellion against life itself. This is by a man named Thorsilev from the University of Michigan. In one form or another, he rejects the values and moral codes of society, and because of this he is often unrepentant by society's standards. Often the Byronic hero is characterized by a guilty memory of some unnamed sexual crime. Due to these characteristics, the Byronic hero is often a figure of repulsion as well as fascination. So how can Huck Finn be considered a Byronic hero? Well, like Childe Harold in Lord Byron's famous text, who really created this Byronic hero, Huck Finn is on the outskirts of society. The Byronic hero has gifts that allow him to come into society, manipulate, take advantage of those in society, and then extract himself once again. In some ways, Huck Finn does the same thing. Going down the Mississippi River, mostly out at nighttime, hiding out, makes trips in, hoodwinks people in society, tricks them, is able to manipulate them to his ends, and then gets back out. Byronic hero. Is that Huck Finn? Another element in this text, an important one, is called the pastoral. The pastoral is a literary style or type that presents a conventionalized picture of rural life, the naturalness and innocence of which is seen in contrast to the corruption and artificiality of city life. Although pastoral works are written from the point of view of shepherds or rustics, they are always penned by highly sophisticated urban poets, ironically. So the pastoral has an interesting place in this text as well. The pastoral as, again, a literary style or type that pictures the innocence and naturalness of nature in contrast to the corrupt artificiality of the city. So some examples. They're all throughout this text, but on page 88, which is chapter 12, here's an example of Twain's use of the pastoral technique or pastoral style in the text. He says, "We had mountains on the Missouri shore and heavy timber on the Illinois side, and the channel was down the Mississippi shore at that place. So we weren't afraid of anybody running across us. We laid there all day and watched the rafts and steamboats spin down the Missouri shore, and upbound steamboats fight the big river in the middle." Let me skip over here. Continues here. This whole chapter, he's employing many of the pastoral elements. On page 90, "This second night, we run between 7 and 8 hours with a current that was making over 4 miles an hour. We catched fish and talked, and we took a swim now and then to keep off sleepiness. It was kind of solemn, drifting down the big, still river, laying on our backs, looking up at the stars. We didn't ever feel like talking aloud. And it weren't often that we laughed, only a little kind of a low chuckle. We had a mighty good weather as a general thing, and nothing ever happened to us at all that night, nor the next, nor the next." A little farther down, "We shot a waterfowl now and then, got up too early in the morning or didn't go to bed early enough in the evening. Take it all around, we lived pretty high." This idea that they're living pretty high on a very simple raft is a bit ironic in some ways, right? You wouldn't expect him to say that about living the high life on a simple little raft floating down the Mississippi with nothing to call their own except this piece of raft. That's it. The sky above. But it's this simple life, this life detached from the city, detached from all of the encumbrances that come with city and civilized life, quote-unquote civilized life, and this simple life. The life on the river is painted in a very pastoral style, a style that emphasizes the innocence and naturalness of living outside the city. There's one more great passage here. We'll give it to another time. So this idea of the pastoral, following the pastoral scene, there's an interesting kind of foil to this pastoral scene that takes place on page 94. It goes like this. "Oh, please don't, boys. I swear I won't ever tell." Another voice said pretty loud, "It's a lie, Jim Turner. You've acted this way before. You always want more than your share of the truck, and you've always got it too, because you've swore. If you didn't tell, you'd tell. But this time you've said it just one time too many. You're the meanest, treacherous hound in this country." Now, why is this? Does this serve? Well, Huck Finn and Jim have been traveling alone out on the river at nighttime mostly for this last few weeks, right, or a few days. And finally, they come across some men from society. And what do you see? You see corruption. You see double dealing. You see thieving, you see rapscallions, you see stuff of society, stuff they've been separate from because they've been in nature, and now, boom, they come into contact with society, and what's the first thing they come across? Thieving fools, criminals. Is this synecdoche? Are these men a part of the whole of society? Is that what Huck Finn is saying? Or is that what Mark Twain is saying about society, that these guys are a picture of thieving, corrupt society? Perhaps. Another part of this tension we see on page 104 of chapter 13. It says, "I struck for the light, but as soon as he turned the corner I went back and got into my skiff and bailed her out, then pulled up shore in the easy water about 600 yards. I tucked myself in among some wood boats, for I couldn't rest easy till I could see the ferry boat start. But take it all around, I was feeling rather comfortable on accounts of taking all this trouble for that gang. for not many would have done it. I wish the widow knowed about it. I judged she would be proud of me for helping these rapscallions, because rapscallions and deadbeats is the kind the widow and good people takes the most interest in. Now, in some ways, we have Mark Twain connecting Huck Finn to a Christ figure. Now, you got to take a little bit of a leap here, but Huck and his subjective morality, I think, is pretty fascinating here. He believes that the widow would be proud of him for helping out these thieves, for helping out these men who are stealing and destroying and terrorizing the river. He shows a certain value for life. And as Mark Twain, in an ironic way, kind of connects Huck Finn to this Christ figure. Christ came, as the scripture says, for the sick and not for the healthy. Christ was criticized by the Pharisees of his day, the religious leaders of his day, for spending time with tax collectors and prostitutes, lowlives. And here Huck, with his limited biblical training from the widow, thinks that in some ways he's being Christ-like for helping out rapscallions and deadbeats by sending out people to help them get off that sinking ship. Is Huck Finn a Christ figure? Is that what he's about? Is that what Mark Twain is doing with Huck Finn? Is he creating an ideal man in Huck Finn? One who sees good and bad in ways different than we do in normal society? Is his view of deadbeats and rapscallions, does that make him more noble? Because he's not as judgmental. Kind of further developing Huck's character here in chapter 14. Huck's perspective of Jim, in some ways, is ironic. He is tainted by his own immaturity and ignorance. And we see him express this in chapter 14. He says, "I never seen such a nigger. If he got a notion in his head once, there weren't no getting it out again. He was the most down on Solomon of any nigger I ever see. So I went to talking about other kings and let Solomon slide. I told about Louis XVI that got his head cut off in France a long time ago, and about his little boy the Dolphin. That would have been a king, but they took and shut him up in jail, and some say he died there. Po little chap. But some says he got out and got away and come to America. That's good, but he'll be pooty lonesome. There ain't no kings here, is there, Huck? No. Then he can't get no situation. What he gwine do? Well, I don't know. Some of them gets on the police, and some of them learns people how to talk French. Why, Huck, don't the French people talk the same way we does? No, Jim. You couldn't understand a word they said, not a single word. Well, now, I be ding busted. How do dat come? I don't know, but it's so. I got some of their jabber out of a book. Suppose a man was to come to you and say, Parlez-vous Franzy? What would you think? I wouldn't think nothing. I'd take and bust him over the head, that is, if he weren't white. I wouldn't allow no nigger to call me that. Shucks, it ain't calling you anything. It's only saying, do you know how to talk French? Well, den, why couldn't he say it? Why, he is a-saying it. That's a Frenchman's way of saying it. A little farther down, this conversation ends with Huck saying, I see it weren't no use wasting words. You can't learn a nigger to argue, so I quit. Again, Huck's own unreliability is shown in this by calling, first of all, the Dauphin, the Prince of France, the son of Louis XVI, a dolphin. And then in his own explanation of reality, his own flawed explanation, his own view of reality that is flawed. We see an ironic blending of Huck's ignorance, Jim's ignorance, and then Huck's correction of Jim, although Huck himself has no idea what he's talking about. So again, an ironic view of knowledge. How do we trust what we know? How do we know what we know? And how can we find out what is true? This is part of the epistemological nature of the text itself. All right. In this next section, 15 to 27, We see many things displayed here. We see Jim's compassion versus Huck's hard heart. In what way is Jim seen as a compassionate character? What way is he portrayed as a compassionate character? In what way is Huck shown as being hardened, or at least hard, being softened as he goes down the river? Is that what's happening? In this text we also see Jim's desire. What is it that Jim wants? What is it that Huck wants? In many ways we see Jim only wanting and desiring to get free, and then to go and free his own wife and children. For Huck, this is more of just an adventure for him, just a free adventure. And so there's some tension there. For Jim, this is not just a fun adventure. This is about escaping for his life. For Huck, he has the luxury of just floating down the river. What is communicated in this tension between the leisure of Huck and the desperation of Jim? In this next section, 15 to 27, also, we see this interesting feud by the Grangerfords and the Shepherdsons. Let's take a look at this. Page 133. This is one more. You might throw this into the category of synecdoche. In what way are the Grangerfords and Shepherdsons a piece of society as a whole? How can they, as a small bit, as a small part of the text, be a picture of all of society? What can the Shepherdson and Grangerford feud be a symbol of? Page 133, that's the beginning of chapter 17. In about a minute, somebody spoke out of a window without putting his head out and says, "Be done, boys. Who's there?" I says, "It's me." "Who's me?" "George Jackson, sir." "What do you want?" "I don't want nothing, sir. I only want to go along by, but the dogs won't let me." "What are you prowling around here this time of night for, hey?" "I weren't prowling around, sir. I fell overboard off the steamboat." "Oh, you did? Did you?" So the Grangerfords and Shepherdsons are in a feud. No one knows why. Even the Shepherdsons and Grangerfords have no idea why they're fighting still. What is being said about society here? What is being said about war? What is being said about national conflict? About Civil War prejudices, perhaps? At the end of this, we do have an interesting use of, perhaps we might call this intertextuality, an inverted Romeo and Juliet motif. So the Romeo and Juliet motif, when you talk about a motif, you're talking about a type of relationship, a type of character that is found in many different types, or many different novels, many different stories, a type of characterization, a type of relationship between characters. So the Romeo and Juliet motif, star-crossed lovers, willing to sacrifice themselves, their own lives for their love. This is a motif, something you see in many different movies and novels and different literary contexts. And so here, I think in an interesting way, we see Mark Twain invert. There's an inverted Romeo and Juliet motif. How is this an inverted Romeo and Juliet motif between Sophia and Harney? Well, one of the first ways is that we have Sophia and Harney are the only ones who live. The rest of the families die after this massive war. So Sophia and Harney, on page 157, thinks I, what does it mean? Down by the woodpile I comes across my Jack and says, "What's it all about?" Says he, "Don't you know, Mars George?" "No," says I don't. "Well, den, Miss Sophia's run off. 'Deed she has. She run off in de night sometime. Nobody don't know jest when. Run off to get married to dat young Harney Shepherdson, you know. Leastways, so dey spec. De family found it out 'bout half an hour ago, maybe a little mo', and I tell you dey wasn't no time loss. Sich another hurrying up guns and hosses you never see. De woman folks has gone for to stir up de relations, and old Mars Saul and de boys tucked de guns and rode up de river. Rode for to try to catch dat young man and kill him 'fore he get across the river with Miss Sophia. I reckon dey's going to be mighty rough times." And in fact, as we see, both families are destroyed. And who lives? Harney and Sophia. And so again, the Romeo and Juliet, obviously that motif ends with, or that story from Shakespeare ends with Romeo and Juliet killing themselves and dying, the family lives, right? And this one that's inverted, why invert it? And that's a great question to ask of the text. In some ways, this is anti-romantic. In some ways, by inverting, kind of destroying, if you will, this classic romantic text, this romantic story by Shakespeare. Romeo and Juliet is just this romantic piece, right? Quintessential romance. Huck Finn flips it on its head. And in much of the same way, this text, Huckleberry Finn, the text itself, is an inverted romance. Takes all the romantic elements and turns them on their head. Changes everything. This could be his way, Mark Twain's way of communicating a new style, a new way of presenting reality and truth, perhaps. A new way of writing. Well, this section ends with some more pastoral city-country tensions. Where else do you see the pastoral at play? City-country tensions. These would be important things to note for your quiz and for the test. We see conflicting values, simple possibilities versus rigid legalism. Twain deals with the conflict of values in America, namely the conflict between the dominant culture's conventional ideality, quite divorced from reality, and the vernacular mentality's rejection of this. So the conflict between the culture's conventional, what is ideal in conventional society? Well, conventional society, what is ideal in conventional society is seen as being divorced from reality. Right? We go back to Tom Sawyer. And Tom Sawyer thinking of all these ideas, and Huck Finn saying, what the heck? This doesn't make any sense. And challenging all these ideas. Well, Tom Sawyer, as a symbol of ideal culture's conventionality. So Tom Sawyer is seen as one who respects the written word, respects the text, respects tradition, no matter what it might be. It might be pirate tradition. Whatever it is, respects tradition, respects the authoritative voices in this tradition. Huck Finn challenges it all. Huck Finn questions all of it. And in truth, throughout this text, we see that society's conventions are portrayed as being divorced from reality, divorced from good logic and good sense. And it's Huck Finn who ends up seeming the most logical, who seems the most truthful in many ways. You see Huck Finn in contrast to a society that is bound up in prejudices and false beliefs, from the Shepherdson-Grangerford feud. How goofy that seems, right? And Huck Finn sees it, and yet that is a picture of society. Why do certain countries hate other countries? Why are there certain prejudices in society? Do we know where this came from? Do we know where this started? No, we don't. Well, the next section covers the Duke and the Dolphin, and much of these guys' sub-story has to do with religious hypocrisy. With these two characters, we see Huck's own tolerance as a character. He is simple-minded, open to learn and grow, and no opportunity for adventure is ruled out. And as Huck deals with the Duke and Dolphin, we see a lot revealed about Huck, more so than we do about the Duke and Dolphin. These guys are just pictures of society, parts of society that Huck seems to have patience for, because he's always willing and open to learn. He's not writing anyone off. And this is a very significant element in Huck's personality, his tolerance, his simple-minded openness to learn and grow. Huck does not see himself as above or better than anyone, and that's an interesting way that Mark Twain kind of pulls that out, draws that out, by having Huck deal very patiently with these two very idiotic guys, the Duke and the Dolphin. In this section as well, we have another Shakespearean style that is mocked for unreality. On page 189, let's take a look at that. It's an interesting section. Part of their way of making money, part of the way the Duke and the Dolphin make money in society is by hoodwinking society through different plays and other kinds of things they're doing. And so here you see it on page 189, chapter 21. So he went to marching up and down, thinking and frowning horrible every now and then. Then he would hoist up his eyebrows. Next he would squeeze his hand on his forehead and stagger back and kind of moan. Next he would sigh, and next he'd let on to drop a tear. It was beautiful to see him. By and by he got it. He told us to give attention. Then he strikes a most noble attitude with one leg shoved forward and his arms stretched away up and his head tilted back looking up at the sky. Then he begins to rip and rave and grit his teeth, and after that, all through his speech, he howled and spread around and swelled up his chest and just knocked the spots out of any acting I see before. So this is Huck Finn describing the Shakespearean actor. This is him describing the Shakespearean acting that the Duke and Dauphin will do. What does a Shakespearean-style actor do? Well, he's very dramatic, obviously, hoisting up eyebrows, staggering, putting his leg out in a certain way, tilting back, very unnatural, very unnatural way of acting or behaving, and that's a Shakespearean actor. A traditional Shakespearean acting is done in this way, a very dramatic way. Well, again, this is critiqued as being very awkward and kind of strange and not realistic. Although Huck thinks it's great acting, it doesn't mimic reality, and so it's seen as odd and funny and silly. It's mocked in many ways. The Shakespearean style of acting is mocked for its unreality. Again, one more way that Mark Twain is flipping on its head this idea of realistic versus romantic, flipping the romantic, showing how it lacks it lacks reality. It lacks a picture of what is real and true, instead of for what is untrue and unreal and strange. All right, so we move into the mob versus the man with Sherburne and Boggs. How do we see the mob represented with Sherburne and Boggs? That's a good question. Who is the villain? Who is the hero? What is ideal? Good question to ask about the Sherburne and Boggs scenario. On 208, we see at the end of chapter 22, they put up bills to advertise for a show, right? At the courthouse, for 3 nights only, the world-renowned tragedians David Garrick the Younger and Edmund Kean the Elder of the London and Continental theaters in their thrilling tragedy of The King's Camelopard, or The Royal Nonsuch. Admission 50 cents. Then at the bottom was the biggest line of all, which said, "Ladies and children not admitted." "There," says he, "if that line don't fetch 'em, I don't know Arkansas." So why is this an important comparison between the Duke and Dauphin versus Huck? Is Huck of the same class? Well, part of what we see here represented in the end of chapter 22 is a tradition that Mark Twain draws in called the picaresque tradition. And this is of or relating to a genre of usually satiric prose fiction originating in the 16th century of Spain and depicting realistic, often humorous adventures of rogue, low-class heroes of low social degree living by their own wits to corrupt society. Picaresque is applied to that class of literature in which the principal person is a Spanish picaro, meaning a rascal, a knave, a rogue, or an adventurer. The Duke and Dauphin are cast in this picaresque tradition. The story is told in a series of loosely connected adventures or episodes, a wandering picaro with no clear direction. What's interesting is the river plays into the picaresque tradition. The river, not Huck, controls his direction. So we have nature versus society. Many of the people around Huck are controlled by social currents. Huck gives himself to natural currents, literally the river. So the picaresque tradition is picked up with both the Duke and Dauphin, but we also see Huck as part of this tradition as well. This low class or low social degree character, a rascal, a knave, a rogue, an adventurer. Who is the real picaro? Is it the Duke and Dauphin? Or is it Huck? And is Huck a picaro at all? The Duke and Dauphin are a part of society, and they are trying to manipulate and cheat society for their own ends. Huck himself, he really gives himself more to the flow and the ebb of the river. He is flowing naturally, if you will. So I would say in some ways you see the Duke and Dolphin as the Picaro, Huck as the foil to the Picaro. He of more natural movement, not manipulating on purpose, nor is he really seeking to pull one over on people, but rather just to live and get by. Alright, so the royal none-such scene is another use of the mob or the crowd. How does this mob differ from the mob that is around Sherburne and Boggs? That's a great question to ask. Throughout this text as well, we see different clothing and costume changes. We have this other tension, appearance versus reality. What is true to life? What is the appearance, and yet what is the reality? And how are these coming into conflict? Now, with our unreliable narrator, that question should come up continually with Huck Finn himself. What appears true, what is true, and how do we know the difference? Can we know the difference? Well, these are key questions, and we'll move into our last kind of final section here. Chapter 28 to 35. Huck's character, we see some changes toward the end of the text where there's certain tendernesses that are revealed in this section as he really connects with these sisters, these young ladies. Huck knows what he knows what has been taught, and yet his feelings run in conflict with what he's been taught. And what does he want to choose? Does he want to choose what he's been taught by society, or does he want to choose what he feels is right naturally? Again, this kind of goes with the idea of book learning versus experiential learning, what is learned by nature. And again, the question of the noble savage. As Huck Finn trusts himself, he is rejecting the book learning of society. He is rejecting the authoritative figures of society. On 296, key passage here. This is chapter 31. It was a close place. I took it up and held it in my hand. I was a-trembling because I'd got to decide forever betwixt two things. And I knowed it. I studied a minute, sort of holding my breath, and then says to myself, all right, then I'll go to hell. And tore it up. It was awful thoughts and awful words, but they was said, and I let them stay said, and never thought no more about reforming. I shoved the whole thing out of my head and said I would take up wickedness again, which was in my line, being brung up to it, and the other warn't. And for a starter, I would go to work and steal Jim out of slavery again, and if I could think up anything worse, I would do that too. Because as long as I was in, and in for good, I might as well go the whole hog. Now, ironically, this is Huck debating whether or not to turn Jim in. And he chooses to go to hell. He believes that he will go to hell for refusing or for breaking the law and doing the work of an abolitionist. He believes he would go to hell for that, morally speaking, right? This is one more key time of Huck shedding society's prejudices, shedding belief systems, in some ways rejecting society's view of a black slave, and taking instead more natural feeling of friendship and love and brotherly affection that runs in direct contrast or conflict to seeing a black slave as cattle, as a horse, as like a stallion, no better than someone's personal property. For Huck, that ran in conflict, direct conflict with his natural feeling for his fellow man. And at the end of the text here, we have Tom re-enter the novel, re-enter the action. Tom is constantly being referred to in the text, always at points of romantic intersection. At what point is something is done a certain way, when things need to be done in a very sophisticated way, or in a way that involves pomp and circumstance, a way that involves something dramatic. Tom Sawyer is always mentioned, right? But by this time in the text, look at page 330. By this time in the text, we know Huck Finn pretty well. And he seems very different now from Tom Sawyer. He says in chapter 35, "Blame it, this whole thing is just as easy and awkward as it can be, and so it makes it so rotten difficult to get up a difficult plan." Tom Sawyer always wants a difficult plan. There ain't no watchman to be drugged. Now there ought to be a watchman. There ain't even a dog to give a sleeping mixture to. And there's Jim chained by one leg with a 10-foot chain to the leg of his bed. Why, all you got to do is lift up the bedstead and slip off the chain. And Uncle Silas, he trusts everybody, sends the key to the pumpkin-headed nigger and don't send nobody to watch the nigger. Jim could have got out of that window hole before this, only there wouldn't be no use trying to travel with a 10-foot chain on his leg. Why, drat it, Huck, it's the stupidest arrangement I ever see. You got to invent all the difficulties. So here's Tom Sawyer, back in the scene here, wanting to invent difficulties. Why? Because he wants the romantic, he wants the difficult, he wants the dramatic. He doesn't want the realistic, he doesn't want the pragmatic. And so in many ways, in light of Jim's plight and family, a horrid tragedy is staged through Tom's light-hearted adventure prank. In light of Jim's plight, and in light of his family's plight, who are still stuck in slavery, we see Tom's dramatic romanticism take on a tone that seems dark and horrible in many ways at the end of this text. Custom and reality, meaning versus tradition, Huck versus Tom. This is the central tension. Tom is interested in traditions, texts, and oppression, and perhaps Tom's allegiance to traditions and texts is the source of oppression and societal oppression. Society's unwillingness to divorce itself, to cut itself off from tradition, is perhaps what makes prejudices and oppression continue. Is that true? Is our unwillingness to look critically at our traditions, is that what continues to allow harmful, oppressive situations to exist? All right, the final episode here. We go to the last paragraph. Tom's most well now. Got his bullet round his neck, on a watch guard for a watch, and is always seeking what time it is, and so there ain't nothing more to write about. And I am rotten glad of it, because if I had a knowed what a trouble it was to make a book, I wouldn't have tackled it, and ain't a-going to no more. But I reckon I got to light out for the territory ahead of the rest, because Aunt Sally, she's going to adopt me and civilize me, and I can't stand it. I've been there before. What is it that Huck rejects? He rejects Aunt Sally, yes. He rejects Tom Sawyer's romanticism, yes. And he rejects the oppressive nature and the oppressive traditions of civilized society. I hope you enjoyed it. That's just the tip of the iceberg on this text. There's much more to go for, but for a nice survey class, I believe it was a good start into the great text that Mark Twain wrote called Huckleberry Finn.